Hey guys, today we're diving deep into one of history's most brutal and unforgiving eras, medieval warfare. Whether you're watching from the comfort of your home in New York, London, or anywhere else around the world, prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about honor, chivalry, and the so-called glory of medieval battle. The number 28,000 isn't just a statistic. It represents the staggering death toll from just one of many devastating medieval conflicts. But this isn't just about numbers on a page. This is about real people, real families torn apart, and real communities devastated by the relentless machinery of medieval war, from the muddy fields of Agincourt to the siege walls of Constantinople. From the Crusades that carved bloody paths across continents to the 100 Years' War that redefined European politics, we'll explore how warfare in the Middle Ages was far more complex, brutal, and transformative than Hollywood has ever shown. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's uncover the harsh realities that shaped our world for centuries. Trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never look at a medieval movie the same way again. The collapse of the Roman Empire didn't just end an era, it unleashed centuries of violence that would reshape Europe forever. Picture this, the most powerful military machine in human history suddenly fragmenting into dozens of warring factions, each desperate to claim their piece of the crumbling empire. As centralized authority crumbled, local strongmen emerged with their own armies, their own rules, and their own brutal methods of maintaining power. The transformation was staggering. Roman legions, once famous for their discipline and coordinated tactics, gave way to loosely organized war bands that relied more on individual prowess than collective strategy. The famous Roman testudo formation was replaced by the furious charge of Germanic warriors, their battle cries echoing across battlefields that would have been unrecognizable to Caesar's veterans. This chapter explores how the fall of Rome created a power vacuum that was filled by Germanic tribes, Viking raiders, and feudal lords. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks didn't just conquer Roman territories, they fundamentally changed how warfare was conducted. Where Romans had relied on engineering, logistics, and disciplined formations, these new powers emphasized personal combat skills, loyalty to individual leaders, and the psychological impact of fearsome warriors. The Viking Age brought another dimension to early medieval warfare. These seafaring warriors didn't just raid coastal settlements, they revolutionized military mobility. A Viking longship could carry 30 to 40 warriors hundreds of miles up rivers, striking deep into the heart of kingdoms that thought themselves safe from seaborne attack. The psychological impact was enormous. The sight of dragon-proud ships appearing on the horizon became synonymous with death and destruction. Consider the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where a single Viking warrior allegedly held off an entire English army at a narrow bridge, killing dozens of attackers before finally being brought down by a spear thrust from below. This wasn't just military tactics, it was theater of war, where individual heroics could determine the fate of entire campaigns. The emergence of the feudal system wasn't just a political development, it was a military necessity born from the chaos of the post-Roman world. Every lord needed warriors, every warrior needed land, and every piece of land needed to be defended. This created a cycle of violence that would define medieval society for centuries. The feudal contract was simple, military service in exchange for land tenure. But the reality was far more complex and brutal. A feudal knight wasn't just a warrior, he was a mobile siege engine, a psychological weapon, and a symbol of authority all rolled into one. The development of heavy cavalry during this period changed the nature of battlefield combat forever. A mounted knight in full armor could smash through infantry formations that would have stopped Roman legionaries cold, but this period also saw the emergence of new defensive technologies. The Motte and Bailey Castle, a simple wooden tower on an artificial mound surrounded by a fortified courtyard, became the dominant military architecture of the early medieval period. These weren't just defensive positions, they were bases of operation for aggressive raids against neighboring territories. The Carolingian military reforms under Charlemagne represented the first serious attempt to organize Early medieval warfare along more systematic lines. The creation of the Scara, elite military units that combined Roman discipline with Germanic warrior culture, pointed toward the more sophisticated military organizations that would emerge in later centuries, yet even these reforms couldn't eliminate the fundamental brutality of early medieval warfare. Archaeological evidence from battlefields of this period reveals the horrific reality behind the romantic myths. Mass graves filled with bodies showing evidence of terrible wounds. Settlements burned to the ground and entire populations displaced by roving armies that lived off the land they conquered. Forget everything you've seen in movies about graceful sword duels and honorable combat. Medieval warfare was dirty, desperate, and deadly. A knight's armor might protect him from the sword, but it couldn't save him from a poleaxe to the head or a crossbow bolt through the visor. The reality of medieval combat was far more brutal and complex than any Hollywood production has ever dared to show. Let's start with the weapons themselves. A medieval sword wasn't just a weapon, it was a precision instrument designed to exploit the weaknesses in armor. The evolution from the broad-bladed spatha of the early medieval period to the narrow, thrusting swords of the late medieval era reflects the constant arms race between weapon makers and armor smiths. Consider the longsword, perhaps the most iconic medieval weapon. Weighing typically between 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, it was perfectly balanced for both cutting and thrusting. The technique of half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand to deliver precise thrusts at close range, could punch through armor joints that would deflect a traditional swing. Master swordsmen spent years learning to read their opponent's movements, to anticipate attacks and to exploit the split-second openings that could mean the difference between life and death. But swords were weapons of last resort for many medieval warriors. The real killing was done by polearms, weapons that combined reach, leverage, and devastating impact. The halberd, with its axe blade, spear point, and backspike, could chop through armor, pierce chainmail, or hook a rider from his horse. A well-trained halberdier could keep even the most heavily armored knight at bay, turning the battlefield into a deadly dance of thrust, parry, and counterattack. The crossbow represented a quantum leap in medieval military technology. Unlike the longbow, which required years of training and tremendous physical strength, a crossbow could be operated by virtually anyone with minimal training. The psychological impact was enormous. Suddenly, a common peasant could kill a knight with a single shot. The church's attempt to ban crossbows in 1139 as too deadly for Christian warfare only emphasized how revolutionary this weapon was. Medieval armor was equally sophisticated. A full suit of plate armor wasn't just protective gear, it was a masterwork of engineering that could deflect sword blows, turn aside arrows, and distribute the impact of mace strikes across the entire body. But it came at a cost. A full suit of armor could weigh 50 to 60 pounds, and cost more than a peasant family would earn in a lifetime. The reality of armored combat was exhausting. Medieval warriors had to be incredibly fit to fight effectively in armor. Training records from the period describe knights practicing for hours in full armor, building the strength and endurance needed to swing a sword or wield a polearm while encased in steel. The physical demands were so intense that many knights were forced to retire from active combat by their 30s. Medieval battle formations were equally complex. The English longbowmen at Agincourt didn't just stand in a line and shoot, they were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, protected by stakes driven into the ground, and supported by men-at-arms ready to engage in close combat. The famous Schiltron formations of Scottish spearmen created hedgehogs of steel that could stop cavalry charges dead in their tracks. Combat techniques varied dramatically by weapon and situation. A mace was designed to crush armor through blunt force trauma. The impact could break bones even if the armor remained intact. A warhammer combined the crushing power of a mace with the concentrated impact of a spike that could punch through even the finest plate armor. The psychological effect of these weapons was as important as their physical impact. The sound of a mace striking a helmet could be heard across a battlefield, serving as a constant reminder of the violence surrounding every warrior. The development of specialized combat techniques reflected the sophistication of medieval warfare. Medieval fighting manuals, such as those written by Johannes Lichtenauer and Fiore de Liberi, describe complex techniques for different weapons and situations. These weren't just instruction manuals, they were philosophical treatises on the art of war, combining practical advice with deeper insights into the psychology of combat. Hand-to-hand combat in medieval warfare was brutally intimate. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields reveals the close-quarters nature of much medieval fighting. Skulls crushed by maces, bones pierced by arrowheads, and cut marks from swords paint a picture of warfare that was personal, violent, and terrifying. The famous mass grave at Toten, site of the largest battle of the Wars of the Roses, contains over 40 skeletons showing evidence of multiple wounds, suggesting that the fighting continued even after warriors were down. The role of horses in medieval combat cannot be overstated. A destrier, the heavy war horse of the medieval knight, was trained for combat just as intensively as its rider. These animals could kick, bite, and trample enemies, turning the horse and rider combination into a single, deadly weapon. The psychological impact of heavy cavalry was enormous. The sound of hundreds of armored horses charging could break enemy formations before the knights even reached the battle line. But medieval warfare wasn't just about individual combat skills. Success required coordination, timing, and the ability to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. The Battle of Crécy demonstrated how new tactics could overcome traditional advantages. English longbowmen, protected by dismounted knights and positioned on favorable terrain, devastated a French army that relied on traditional heavy cavalry charges. The diversity of medieval weapons reflects the complexity of medieval warfare. From the simple spear that could be mass-produced and used by peasant levies to the sophisticated crossbow that required skilled craftsmen to manufacture, medieval armies had to balance effectiveness, cost, and availability. A successful medieval army needed a mix of weapons and warriors, capable of adapting to different tactical situations. Medieval siege warfare was perhaps the most brutal form of combat ever devised. When armies couldn't meet in open battle, they turned to siege warfare, a grinding war of attrition that could last months or even years, leaving thousands dead from disease, starvation, and violence. The siege was where medieval warfare reached its most sophisticated and most horrifying. Extremes. The development of castle architecture and siege engines created an arms race that lasted centuries. Consider the evolution of the castle itself. What began as simple wooden palisades on artificial mounds evolved into massive stone fortresses with multiple lines of defense, murder holes, and architectural features designed specifically to channel attackers into killing zones. The concentric castle design, perfected by Edward I during his conquest of Wales, represented the pinnacle of medieval defensive architecture. Caerphilly Castle, with its multiple rings of walls, water defenses, and carefully planned sightlines, could withstand siege by the largest armies of its time. But even these massive fortifications had weaknesses that clever besiegers learned to exploit. Siege engines were the heavy artillery of the medieval world. The massive trebuchet, capable of hurling 300-pound stones over castle walls, represented a quantum leap in destructive capability. These weren't simple catapults. They were sophisticated machines that required skilled engineers to construct and operate. The counterweight trebuchet, developed in the 12th century, could hurl projectiles with devastating accuracy and force, but trebuchets weren't just used to breach walls. Medieval besiegers understood psychological warfare as well as physical destruction. They would catapult diseased animal carcasses, severed heads of captured defenders, and even human waste into besieged cities. The goal wasn't just to spread disease. It was to break the morale of the defenders and convince them that surrender was their only option. The development of specialized siege tactics reflected the sophistication of medieval military thinking. Undermining the practice of digging tunnels beneath castle walls and then collapsing them required engineering skills that rivaled those of the castle builders themselves. The siege of Rochester Castle in 1215 saw King John's engineers dig a tunnel beneath the castle's great tower, shore it up with wooden supports, then set fire to the supports using the fat from 40 pigs to create an intensely hot blaze that brought down an entire corner of the tower. Siege towers, mobile fortifications that allowed attackers to reach the height of castle walls, were marvels of medieval engineering. These massive wooden structures, often reaching heights of 60 feet or more, had to be built on site and moved into position while under constant attack from the defenders. The logistics alone were staggering. The timber required for a single siege tower could deforest several acres. The use of Greek fire and other incendiary weapons added another dimension to siege warfare. This mysterious substance, whose exact composition remains unknown to this day, could burn on water and was nearly impossible to extinguish. Byzantine defenders used it to devastating effect against Arab siege engines, and its reputation for destruction spread throughout the medieval world. But perhaps the most effective siege weapon was time itself. A properly supplied castle could hold out for months or even years, but few medieval armies could maintain a siege for extended periods. The logistics of feeding, housing, and maintaining an army in the field were staggering. Disease was a constant threat. More medieval soldiers died from dysentery and other camp diseases than were ever killed in battle. The siege of Antioch during the First Crusade illustrates the brutal reality of medieval siege warfare. The Crusader army besieged the city for 8 months, during which time they suffered more casualties from starvation and disease than they had inflicted on the defenders. When they finally captured the city, they immediately found themselves besieged by a relief army, turning besiegers into besieged in a matter of days. Civilian populations suffered enormously during medieval sieges. The laws of war in the medieval period were clear. A city that resisted siege could be sacked if captured, while a city that surrendered could expect mercy. But the reality was often far different. Even surrendering cities might be looted, and civilians were frequently caught between defending armies that saw them as resources to be exploited, and attacking armies that saw them as obstacles to be eliminated. The psychological impact of siege warfare extended far beyond the immediate participants. The knowledge that one city or castle could be surrounded, cut off from all outside help, and slowly starved into submission created a climate of fear that influenced medieval politics and diplomacy. The threat of siege was often more effective than siege itself. Siege warfare also drove technological innovation. The development of more powerful crossbows, better armor, and more sophisticated fortification techniques all emerged from the demands of siege combat. The arms race between siege engines and fortifications pushed medieval engineering to its limits and beyond. The role of mercenary engineers became crucial during the later medieval period. Master engineers like Villard de Honnecourt traveled from siege to siege, selling their expertise to the highest bidder. These men understood mathematics, physics, and material science in ways that would have been impressive even by modern standards. Defense of a besieged castle required as much skill and preparation as attacking one. Defenders had to manage food and water supplies, maintain morale during months of confinement, and constantly repair damage caused by enemy siege engines. The development of specialized defensive techniques, from murder holes that allowed defenders to attack besiegers from above to carefully planned sally ports for launching surprise attacks, showed that medieval defenders were as innovative as their attackers. The economic impact of siege warfare was staggering. A single major siege could bankrupt a kingdom. The cost of maintaining an army in the field for months, combined with the expense of building and operating siege engines, meant that only the wealthiest rulers could afford prolonged siege warfare. This economic reality often determined the outcome of medieval conflicts more than tactical brilliance or individual heroism. The Crusades represent one of the most complex and controversial chapters in medieval warfare. Marketed as holy wars to reclaim the Holy Land, they became exercises in mass slaughter that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives over 2 centuries. The contradiction between Christian ideals of mercy and the brutal reality of crusading warfare reveals the dark heart of medieval conflict. The First Crusade began with Pope Urban II's call to arms in 1095, but what followed was far from the organized religious expedition that church leaders had envisioned. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, devolved into a series of pogroms against Jewish communities across Europe before the majority of these poorly equipped peasants were slaughtered by Turkish forces in Anatolia, the official First Crusade that followed was better organized but no less brutal. The march across Europe and through Byzantium was marked by constant conflict with local populations. The Crusaders weren't just fighting Muslims, they fought Byzantine Christians, fellow Crusaders, and anyone who stood between them and their goals. The Siege of Nicaea in 1097 demonstrated the Crusaders' tactical adaptation. They combined Western siege techniques with Byzantine naval support to capture a city that had resisted Muslim armies for years, but it was the capture of Jerusalem in 1099 that revealed the true nature of crusading warfare. Contemporary accounts describe crusaders wading through blood in the Temple Mount, systematically slaughtering not just Muslim defenders but Jewish civilians who had taken refuge in synagogues. The chronicler Raymond of Aguilers wrote that men rode in blood up to their knees in bridle reins, an image that haunted both contemporary observers and later historians. The establishment of the Crusader states created a unique form of colonial warfare. The Frankish kingdoms of Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli were tiny Christian enclaves surrounded by hostile Muslim territories. Survival required constant warfare, sophisticated intelligence networks, and the ability to play Muslim factions against each other. The military orders, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and Teutonic Knights, became the backbone of Crusader military power. These military orders represented something new in medieval warfare: permanent, professional armies dedicated to holy war. The Templars alone possessed over 600 castles and fortified positions across the Middle East. Their military innovations, including the development of new cavalry tactics and siege techniques, influenced warfare throughout medieval Europe. But their wealth and power also made them targets. The destruction of the Templars by Philip IV of France in 1307 was as much about seizing their assets as it was about religious concerns. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, demonstrated how quickly crusading enthusiasm could turn to disaster. Led by King Louis VII of France and Emperor Conrad III of Germany, this crusade achieved virtually nothing while costing thousands of lives. The failure was partly due to poor planning and leadership, but it also reflected the sophisticated military adaptation of Muslim forces under leaders like Nur ad-Din. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 triggered the Third Crusade, the most famous of the crusading expeditions. The confrontation between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin has become legendary, but the reality was far more complex than the romanticized accounts suggest. Both leaders were skilled military commanders who understood that warfare was as much about economics and logistics as it was about individual combat. The Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin destroyed the largest Crusader army ever assembled, showcased the evolution of Middle Eastern military tactics. Saladin's use of mounted archers, his exploitation of the Crusaders' water shortage, and his ability to maintain unit cohesion during a running battle that lasted 2 days, demonstrated military sophistication that matched anything the Crusaders could field. The Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, revealed how far the crusading movement had strayed from its original goals. The decision to attack Constantinople instead of the Holy Land was driven by Venetian commercial interests and the Crusaders' inability to pay for transportation. The sack of Constantinople was one of the most devastating attacks on a Christian city in medieval history, effectively ending the Byzantine Empire's role as a major power. The Children's Crusade of 1212, though historically questionable in its details, represents the tragic extent to which crusading fever could grip medieval society. Thousands of children and adolescents, convinced that their innocence would succeed where adult armies had failed, marched toward the Mediterranean expecting the seas to part. Most never returned home. The later crusades showed diminishing returns and increasing brutality. The Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars in southern France demonstrated how crusading ideology could be turned against fellow Christians. The massacre at Béziers in 1209, where the papal legate reportedly said, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own," showed how religious warfare could justify almost any atrocity. The military impact of the Crusades extended far beyond the Middle East. Returning crusaders brought back new military techniques, architectural innovations, and strategic concepts. The development of military engineering, the refinement of siege warfare, and the evolution of cavalry tactics all benefited from the exchange of military knowledge during the crusading period. The economic impact was equally significant. The Crusades accelerated the development of banking, international trade, and military logistics. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa built commercial empires by financing and supplying crusading expeditions. The military orders became medieval Europe's first international corporations, managing vast estates and commercial networks that stretched from England to the Holy Land. The Crusades also created new forms of military organization and financing. The development of crusade taxation, the sale of indulgences to fund military expeditions, and the creation of permanent military institutions all emerged from the demands of holy war. These innovations would influence European military development for centuries. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Crusades was ideological. The concept of holy war, the idea that violence could be sanctified by religious purpose, became deeply embedded in Western military thinking. The notion that God favored Christian armies, that dying in battle for the faith guaranteed salvation, and that enemies of Christianity deserved no mercy would influence European warfare long after the last crusade had ended. The ultimate failure of the Crusades, the permanent loss of the Holy Land to Muslim forces, marked a turning point in medieval warfare. The fall of Acre in 1291 ended 2 centuries of Christian presence in the Levant and forced European military thinking to adapt to new realities. The age of crusading was over, but the lessons learned in the deserts and mountains of the Middle East would continue to shape Western military development for generations to come. The 100 Years' War between England and France wasn't just a single conflict. It was a series of devastating campaigns that transformed medieval warfare and left entire regions depopulated. This was warfare on an industrial scale, with armies numbering in the tens of thousands and battles that could decide the fate of nations. We'll examine the pivotal battles that defined this conflict. Crécy, where English longbowmen decimated. French knights. Poitiers, where a French king was captured. And Agincourt, where Henry V's outnumbered army achieved impossible victory. But we'll also explore the lesser-known campaigns, the brutal sieges, and the devastating impact on civilian populations. The war introduced new technologies and tactics that would change warfare forever. The use of gunpowder weapons, the decline of heavy cavalry, and the rise of professional armies all emerged from this century of conflict. No force in medieval history was more devastating than the Mongol Empire. In just a few decades, Mongol armies conquered more territory than any empire before or since, leaving a trail of destruction that reshaped the entire medieval world. This chapter explores how the Mongols revolutionized warfare through superior mobility, psychological warfare, and ruthless efficiency. We'll examine their siege techniques, their use of Chinese engineers, and their deliberate policy of terror that often convinced cities to surrender without a fight. The numbers are staggering. Entire cities wiped out, populations reduced by 90%, and death tolls that may have reached into the millions. The Mongols didn't just conquer, they systematically destroyed existing power structures and rebuilt them according to their own vision. The Black Death didn't just kill a third of Europe's population, it fundamentally changed how wars were fought. With dramatically reduced populations, armies became smaller, more professional, and more reliant on new technologies and tactics. This chapter examines how the plague influenced military recruitment, tactics, and objectives. Will explore how the labor shortage created by the plague led to the rise of professional soldiers and mercenary companies. and how the psychological impact of the plague influenced military thinking. The plague also became a weapon of war itself. Besieging armies would catapult infected corpses into cities, and the threat of disease often proved more effective than conventional siege weapons. The introduction of gunpowder weapons marked the beginning of the end for traditional medieval warfare. Early cannons could breach castle walls that had withstood siege for centuries, and handguns could kill an armored knight with a single shot. This chapter explores the technological revolution that transformed warfare in the late medieval period. We'll examine the development of early firearms, the impact of artillery on siege warfare, and the social changes that came with weapons that could make a peasant the equal of a knight. The transition wasn't immediate. For decades, traditional weapons and gunpowder weapons coexisted on the battlefield. But the writing was on the wall, the age of the knight was ending, and the age of the professional soldier was beginning. Medieval warfare wasn't exclusively a male domain. From Joan of Arc's military campaigns to the warrior queens who defended their realms, women played crucial roles in medieval conflicts that have often been overlooked by history. This chapter examines the various ways women participated in medieval warfare as leaders, fighters, siege defenders, and supporters. We'll explore how social attitudes toward women warriors varied across different cultures and time periods, and how their contributions were often minimized or forgotten by male chroniclers, from the Celtic warrior Queen Boudica to the Byzantine empress who led armies into battle. We'll uncover the stories of women who challenged medieval assumptions about gender and warfare. Medieval warfare was expensive. Maintaining armies, building fortifications, and purchasing weapons required enormous resources that shaped the political and economic development of medieval Europe. This chapter explores how the costs of warfare influenced political decisions, drove technological innovation, and created new forms of economic organization. We'll examine how the need to fund armies led to new forms of taxation, how the rise of mercenary companies created a military marketplace, and how warfare both destroyed and created wealth. The economic impact of medieval warfare extended far beyond the battlefield. Wars disrupted trade, devastated agricultural areas, and created refugee populations that strained resources for generations. Medieval commanders understood that warfare was as much about psychology as it was about physical combat. The use of terror, propaganda, and psychological manipulation was as important as any weapon in a medieval army's arsenal. This chapter examines the various forms of psychological warfare employed in medieval conflicts, the use of fearsome imagery, the deliberate cultivation of brutal reputations, and the employment of psychological tactics designed to break enemy morale. Before battle began, from the terrifying war cries that preceded battle to the deliberate display of enemy corpses, medieval warfare was designed to attack the mind as the body. The end of a medieval battle didn't mean the end of dying. Disease, infection, and untreated wounds often killed more soldiers than the battle itself. This chapter explores the brutal reality of medieval medicine and the challenges of treating battlefield injuries. We'll examine how medieval armies dealt with their wounded, the primitive state of medical knowledge, and the social and economic impact of disabled veterans. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that even minor wounds could prove fatal, and the survivors often faced lives of disability and poverty. The aftermath of battle also included the grim business of disposing of the dead, ransommen, prisoners, and dealing with the psychological trauma that we now recognize as PTSD, but was then simply called battle fatigue. Medieval warfare didn't just influence politics and economics, it fundamentally shaped medieval culture, art, literature, and social values. The ideals of chivalry, the popularity of martial epics, and the architectural development of castles all reflected the central role of warfare in medieval life. This chapter explores how the reality of constant warfare influenced medieval artistic expression, religious thought, and social organization. We'll examine how the brutality of medieval warfare coexisted with ideals of honor and chivalry, and how these contradictions shaped medieval culture. From the epic poems that celebrated warrior heroes to the architectural innovations driven by Military necessity. Medieval warfare left its mark on every aspect of medieval society. While battles like Hastings and Agincourt dominate the pages of history books, countless other conflicts shaped the medieval world without receiving the same attention from historians or capturing the popular imagination. This chapter explores some of the lesser-known battles and campaigns that were no less significant for being forgotten, revealing a hidden landscape of violence, struggle, and transformation that defined the medieval experience for millions of ordinary people. We'll examine regional conflicts, civil wars, and smaller-scale battles that nonetheless had major impacts on local populations and political development. These forgotten conflicts remind us that medieval warfare wasn't just about great armies and famous generals. It was about ordinary people caught up in violence beyond their control, communities destroyed and rebuilt, and the countless small decisions and local struggles that ultimately determined the shape of medieval civilization, from the border wars that shaped medieval kingdoms to the peasant rebellions that challenged established authority, from forgotten sieges that lasted for years to skirmishes that changed the fate of entire regions. These forgotten conflicts reveal the true scope and impact of medieval violence. They remind us that history is not just the story of kings and heroes, but of the countless unnamed warriors, survivors, and victims whose experiences shaped the world we inhabit today. The great battles of medieval history often overshadow the constant, grinding warfare that characterized frontier regions throughout the medieval period. These border wars, fought between neighboring kingdoms, duchies, and petty lordships, rarely produced decisive victories or dramatic turning points, but their cumulative impact on medieval society was enormous. The Welsh marches provide a perfect example of this forgotten dimension of medieval warfare. For centuries, the border between England and Wales was marked not by a single great battle, but by hundreds of small conflicts, raids, and skirmishes that shaped the lives of generations of border dwellers. The Marcher Lords, established by the Norman conquerors to guard the Welsh frontier, waged a constant war of attrition that was punctuated by occasional larger campaigns, but defined by endless cycles of raid and counter-raid. The Battle of Minid. Carn in 1081, fought between rival Welsh princes with Norman assistance, exemplifies these forgotten conflicts. Though it determined the fate of medieval Wales by establishing Griffith ap Cynan as a major power, it remains largely unknown outside specialist circles. The battle involved complex alliances between Welsh princes and Norman lords, demonstrating the intricate political relationships that characterized frontier warfare. Its aftermath saw the establishment of new power structures that would influence Welsh politics for generations. Yet it receives barely a footnote in most general histories of medieval warfare. Similarly, the Scottish borders witnessed centuries of warfare that shaped the development of both England and Scotland, but remains largely absent from popular historical narratives. The Battle of the Standard in 1138, fought near Northallerton, was crucial in defining the northern boundary of England and establishing the military reputation of the Anglo-Norman nobility. Yet it is far less well known than contemporaneous conflicts in France or the Holy Land. These border wars developed their own distinctive characteristics and military cultures. The constant threat of raids led to the development of unique defensive strategies, including the construction of tower houses, peel towers, and other fortifications designed to withstand sudden attacks rather than prolonged sieges. The military tactics evolved to emphasize mobility, local knowledge, and rapid response rather than the formal battlefield tactics associated with larger conflicts. The social impact of frontier warfare was profound and lasting. Border communities developed distinctive cultures that emphasized military readiness, clan loyalty, and the ability to survive in a landscape where violence was always possible. The border reivers of the later medieval period, who conducted organized raids across the Anglo-Scottish frontier, represented the culmination of centuries of border warfare that had created entire societies organized around the realities of constant conflict. The Iberian Peninsula witnessed some of the most complex and prolonged conflicts of the medieval period. Yet many of these wars remain largely unknown outside Spain. The Reconquista, while generally familiar to historians, encompassed hundreds of individual battles, sieges, and campaigns that shaped the development of medieval Spanish kingdoms but have been overshadowed by more famous conflicts elsewhere in Europe. The Battle of Sagranges in 1086 fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Spain by demonstrating the military effectiveness of Almoravid forces and forcing Christian kingdoms to reconsider their strategies and alliances. The battle saw the defeat of Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile by Yusuf ibn Tashfin, marking the beginning of a new phase in the Reconquista that would last for centuries. Despite its strategic importance, the battle remains largely unknown outside specialist studies of medieval Iberian history. The complexity of medieval Spanish warfare extended beyond simple Christian-Muslim conflict. The Taifa kingdoms that emerged after the collapse of the Caliphate of Córdoba fought constantly among themselves, creating a patchwork of alliances and conflicts that involved Christian and Muslim rulers on both sides. The Battle of Ucals in 1108, which saw the death of Sancho Alfonses, the only son of Alfonso VI, exemplifies these complex relationships and their tragic consequences, yet it receives little attention in general histories of medieval warfare. The Siege of Almeria in 1147, conducted by a coalition of Castilian, Leonese, Genoese, and Pisan forces, represents one of the most successful examples of medieval amphibious warfare and international cooperation, yet it remains virtually unknown outside specialist circles. The siege demonstrated the growing naval capabilities of Christian kingdoms and Italian maritime republics, marking a crucial development in medieval military technology and strategy. Medieval Italy witnessed countless conflicts between city-states, papal forces, and imperial armies that shaped the development of Renaissance culture and politics but remain largely forgotten in popular historical memory. The Battle of Legnano in 1176, where the Lombard League defeated Frederick Barbarossa, was crucial in establishing the independence of northern Italian cities and limiting imperial power in Italy, yet it receives far less attention than contemporaneous conflicts in France or England. The War of the Sicilian Vespers 128–11302 involved multiple kingdoms and fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean, yet it remains largely unknown outside specialist studies. The conflict began with a popular uprising against French rule in Sicily but escalated into a major international war involving the kingdoms of Aragon, France, Naples, and the Papal States. The naval battle of the Gulf of Naples in 1284, where the Aragonese fleet defeated the Angevin forces, was crucial in determining the outcome of the war and establishing Aragonese dominance in the western Mediterranean. The peasant uprising known as the Jacquerie, which erupted in northern France in 1358, represents one of the most significant but forgotten conflicts of the medieval period. Named after the derogatory term Jacques used by nobles to refer to peasants, the rebellion involved thousands of rural workers who rose against their feudal lords in response to the economic and social pressures created by the Hundred Years' War and the Black Death. The rebellion began in the village of Saint-Leu-d'Esserent and quickly spread across the Ile-de-France, Picardy, and Champagne regions. The peasants, led by Guillaume Caille, initially achieved remarkable success, capturing numerous castles and defeating several noble armies. Their tactics combined traditional peasant knowledge of local terrain with improvised military strategies that proved surprisingly effective against conventional feudal forces. The Battle of Mello, fought on June 10, 1358, marked the decisive Defeat of the peasant forces by Charles the Bad of Navarre and his noble allies. Despite their defeat, the Jacquerie had lasting consequences for French society, forcing nobles to reconsider their relationship with peasant communities and contributing to the gradual transformation of feudal relationships throughout northern France. The rebellion's impact extended far beyond its immediate military outcomes. The destruction of numerous noble residences and the temporary breakdown of feudal authority demonstrated the fragility of medieval social structures and the potential for popular resistance to established authority. The harsh repression that followed the rebellion's defeat, including the execution of thousands of peasants and the destruction of entire villages, created lasting trauma that influenced rural noble relationships for generations. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, while better known than the Jacquerie, encompassed numerous individual conflicts and battles that remain largely forgotten despite their significance for English social and political development. The revolt began in Essex and Kent but quickly spread across much of England, involving not just peasants but also urban artisans, minor clergy, and even some members of the gentry. The Battle of Billericay, fought between rebel forces and royal troops, demonstrated the military capabilities of popular forces when properly organized and led. Despite their eventual defeat, the rebels showed remarkable tactical sophistication, using their knowledge of local terrain and their superior numbers to achieve initial successes against trained soldiers. The siege of the Tower of London, while ultimately unsuccessful, represented one of the most audacious military actions undertaken by popular forces in medieval England. The rebels' ability to penetrate the heart of royal power and temporarily control London demonstrated the potential for popular movements to challenge established authority. Even when lacking traditional military resources, the revolt's leader, Wat Tyler, remains a controversial figure whose military and political strategies influenced popular movements for centuries. His death at Smithfield, during negotiations with King Richard II, marked the end of the main phase of the rebellion, but not its underlying causes or consequences. The Great German Peasants' War of 1524-1525 had numerous medieval precedents that remain largely forgotten despite their significance for understanding the development of popular resistance in Central Europe. The Bundschuh movement of the late 15th and early 16th centuries encompassed numerous local rebellions and conflicts that challenged feudal authority throughout the German-speaking regions. The Battle of Blingen in 1525, where peasant forces were decisively defeated by the Swabian League, exemplifies these forgotten conflicts. Despite their defeat, the peasants demonstrated remarkable military organization and tactical innovation, using their superior knowledge of local conditions to achieve initial successes against professional armies. The Siege of Munster, while occurring slightly later than the traditional medieval period, had roots in earlier peasant movements and demonstrated the potential for popular forces to create alternative social and political structures. The eventual defeat and massacre of the city's defenders became a cautionary tale that influenced popular movements for generations. The War of the Breton Succession, 1341 to 1365, represents one of the most complex and significant conflicts of the later medieval period, yet it remains largely overshadowed by the broader Hundred Years' War of which it formed a part. The conflict began as a succession dispute between John de Montfort and Charles of Blois, following the death of Duke John III of Brittany, but it evolved into a proxy war between England and France that devastated Brittany for a generation. The Battle of 30, Combat des Trente, fought in 1351 between 30 Breton knights supporting each claimant, has become legendary in Breton culture but remains virtually unknown elsewhere. The battle, fought according to the rules of chivalric combat, saw the forces supporting Charles of Blois defeat those supporting John de Montfort in a conflict that combined elements of formal tournament with deadly serious warfare. The Siege of Hennebont in 1342 demonstrated the crucial role that women could play in medieval warfare when Jeanne de Montfort successfully defended the city against forces loyal to Charles of Blois. Her military leadership and strategic acumen proved crucial to her husband's cause. Yet her role in medieval warfare remains largely unrecognized in general historical accounts. The Battle of Auray in 1364, which finally ended the succession dispute with the victory of John de Montfort's forces, was decided by the tactical innovations of English commanders who had learned from their experiences in the broader Hundred Years' War. The battle demonstrated how military innovations developed in one theater could be successfully applied in different contexts, yet it receives little attention in studies of medieval military development. The Castilian Civil War. The Castilian Civil War, 1351 to 1369, between Pedro the Cruel and his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, involved major international powers and fundamentally altered the balance of power in medieval Spain, yet it remains largely forgotten outside specialist studies. The conflict drew in England, France, Aragon, Portugal, and Granada, making it one of the most international conflicts of the 14th century. The Battle of Najera in 1367, where Edward the Black Prince's English forces defeated Henry of Trastamara's Franco-Castilian army, represented one of the most significant English military victories of the period and demonstrated the continued effectiveness of English tactical innovations in different theaters. Despite its strategic importance, the battle receives far less attention than contemporaneous English victories in France. The Battle of Montiel in 1369, which saw the final defeat and death of Pedro the Cruel, established the Trastamara dynasty on the Castilian throne and fundamentally altered the course of Spanish history. The battle's outcome influenced Spanish foreign policy for generations and contributed to the eventual union of the Spanish kingdoms. Yet it remains largely unknown in general historical accounts. Regional conflicts and local wars. The Wars of Scottish Independence. While the major battles of the Wars of Scottish Independence, such as Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn, are relatively well known, numerous smaller conflicts played crucial roles in determining Scotland's fate but remain largely forgotten. The Battle of Loudon Hill in 1307, where Robert the Bruce defeated an English force led by Aymer de Valence, demonstrated the effectiveness of guerrilla tactics and helped establish Bruce's reputation as a military leader. The Siege of Bothwell Castle in 1337, conducted by Andrew Murray, exemplifies the forgotten conflicts that shaped medieval Scotland. The siege demonstrated the importance of controlling strategic fortifications and the role that technical innovations in siege warfare played in determining political outcomes. The Battle of Halidon Hill in 1303, while more significant than many forgotten battles, demonstrates how even relatively well-documented conflicts can be overshadowed by more famous contemporaneous events. The English victory established Edward Balliol on the Scottish throne and demonstrated the continued effectiveness of English longbow tactics, yet it receives far less attention than English victories in France. The Welsh Wars of Independence. The Welsh struggle for independence involved numerous conflicts that shaped the development of medieval Wales, but remain largely unknown outside Welsh historical scholarship. The Battle of Bringlass in 1402, where Owain Glyndwr's forces defeated an English army, marked the high point of the last major Welsh rebellion against English rule and demonstrated the potential for indigenous forces to achieve victory against seemingly superior opponents. The Siege of Harlech Castle, 1404 to 1409, which saw Owain Glyndwr establish his court in one of Edward I's great fortresses, represented a remarkable reversal of the usual pattern of English domination in Wales. The siege's eventual outcome, with the castle's recapture by English forces, marked the beginning of the end for Welsh independence. Yet it receives little attention in general accounts of medieval warfare. The Battle of Plomelin in 1405, fought between English forces and Welsh rebels, exemplifies the numerous small-scale conflicts that characterized the Welsh Wars but have been forgotten by history. Despite their limited scope, these battles cumulatively determined the fate of medieval Wales and influenced the development of Welsh national identity, urban conflicts, and civic wars. The Italian Commune Wars. Medieval Italy witnessed countless conflicts between city-states that shaped the development of Renaissance culture and politics but remain largely forgotten in popular historical memory. The War of the Eight Saints, 1375 to 1378, fought between Florence and the Papal States, involved numerous battles and sieges that demonstrated the military capabilities of Italian city-states and their willingness to challenge even papal authority. The Battle of Campaldino in 1289, where Florentine forces defeated those of Arezzo, was crucial in establishing Florence's dominance in Tuscany and included among its participants a young Dante Alighieri. Despite its cultural significance and strategic importance, the battle remains largely unknown outside specialist studies of medieval Italian history. The Siege of Pisa, 1405 to 1406, conducted by Florentine forces, marked the end of Pisan independence and demonstrated the effectiveness of economic warfare combined with traditional siege tactics. The siege's success established Florence as the dominant power in Tuscany and influenced the development of Renaissance political thought, yet it receives little attention in general historical accounts. The Flemish revolts, the medieval Low Countries, witnessed numerous urban revolts and civic conflicts that shaped the development of medieval commerce and urban culture, but remain largely forgotten outside specialist studies. The Battle of the Golden Spurs, Courtrai, in 1302, while relatively well known, was part of a broader pattern of urban resistance to feudal authority that involved numerous smaller conflicts. The Siege of Ghent, 1382, conducted by French forces, supporting the Count of Flanders against urban rebels, demonstrated the military capabilities of medieval urban communities and their willingness to resist feudal authority. The siege's eventual success marked a temporary setback for urban independence, but contributed to the long-term development of urban political institutions. The Battle of Rysbeck in 1382, where French forces defeated Flemish rebels, exemplifies the forgotten conflicts that shaped medieval urban development. Despite the rebels' defeat, their military organization and tactical innovations influenced urban military development throughout the Low Countries. Ecclesiastical conflicts and religious wars. The investiture conflicts. The investiture controversy between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire involved numerous military conflicts that shaped the development of medieval church-state relations, but remain largely forgotten outside specialist studies. The Battle of Volta Mantovana in 1080, where imperial forces defeated papal troops, was crucial in determining the military balance between empire and papacy during this critical period. The Siege of Canossa, 1077, while famous for Emperor Henry IV's submission to Pope Gregory VII, was part of a broader military campaign that involved numerous forgotten battles and sieges. The military aspects of the investiture controversy demonstrated the importance of armed force in determining ecclesiastical political relationships and influenced the development of medieval political thought. The Battle of Carcano in 1160, fought between imperial and papal forces, exemplifies the numerous military conflicts that characterize church-state relations, but have been overshadowed by their political and religious significance. Despite their military importance, these battles receive little attention in general accounts of medieval warfare. The Albigensian Crusade. The Albigensian Crusade 1209–1229 involved numerous battles and sieges that shaped the development of medieval France, but remain largely forgotten outside specialist studies. The Siege of Béziers in 1209, which resulted in the massacre of the city's population, demonstrated the ruthless methods employed in religious warfare and influenced the development of medieval attitudes toward heresy and religious dissent. The Battle of Muret in 1213, where crusading forces defeated a coalition of southern French nobles and Aragonese troops, was crucial in determining the outcome of the crusade and establishing northern French dominance over the Languedoc region. Despite its strategic importance, the battle remains largely unknown in general historical accounts. The Siege of Toulouse, 1217–1218, which saw the death of Simon de Montfort, marked a turning point in the crusade and demonstrated the resilience of southern French resistance to northern conquest. The siege's military aspects, including innovative siege techniques and urban defense strategies, influenced medieval military development but received little attention in general studies. Maritime conflicts and naval wars. The forgotten naval battles. Medieval naval warfare involved numerous battles and campaigns that shaped the development of maritime technology and strategy, but remain largely forgotten outside specialist naval histories. The Battle of Sandwich in 1217, where English forces defeated a French invasion fleet, was crucial in determining the outcome of the First Barons' War and demonstrating the importance of naval power in medieval conflicts. The Battle of Slize in 1340, while relatively well known as the opening engagement of the Hundred Years' War, overshadows numerous other naval conflicts that were equally important for medieval maritime development. The Battle of Winchelsea in 1350, where English forces defeated a Castilian fleet, demonstrated the continued importance of naval warfare in medieval conflicts and the growing sophistication of medieval naval tactics. The Siege of La Rochelle, 1372 to 1373, which involved significant naval operations, marked a crucial turning point in the Hundred Years' War, but receives little attention in general historical accounts. The siege demonstrated the importance of controlling sea lanes and the role that naval power played in determining the outcome of medieval conflicts. The Mediterranean naval wars. The medieval Mediterranean witnessed numerous naval conflicts that shaped the development of maritime commerce and naval technology, but remain largely forgotten outside specialist studies. The Battle of Giglio in 1241, where imperial forces defeated a Genoese fleet carrying prelates to a papal council, demonstrated the intersection of naval warfare with broader political conflicts and influenced the development of medieval papal-imperial relations. The Battle of Meloria in 1284, where Genoese forces decisively defeated the Pisan fleet, marked the end of Pisan naval dominance and established Genoa as the dominant maritime power in the western Mediterranean. Despite its strategic importance, the battle remains largely unknown outside specialist studies of medieval Italian history. The Siege of Acre, 1291, which marked the end of the Crusader states in the Holy Land, involved significant naval operations that demonstrated the importance of sea power in determining the outcome of medieval conflicts. The siege's naval aspects, including the use of innovative siege techniques and the role of maritime logistics, influenced medieval military development, but received little attention in general accounts of the Crusades. The human cost of forgotten war. Civilian casualties and social disruption. The forgotten battles of medieval warfare had profound impacts on civilian populations that extended far beyond the immediate military outcomes. The constant warfare that characterized frontier regions created communities where violence was a constant threat and survival required constant vigilance and adaptation. The demographic impact of forgotten conflicts was often more significant than that of famous battles, precisely because these smaller conflicts were more frequent and affected larger populations over longer periods. The border raids that characterized Anglo-Scottish warfare, for example, displaced thousands of families and destroyed countless communities, yet their cumulative impact receives little attention in general historical accounts. The economic disruption caused by forgotten conflicts often exceeded that of major wars because smaller conflicts lasted longer and received less attention from chroniclers and administrators. The constant threat of violence in frontier regions discouraged agricultural investment and commercial development, creating cycles of poverty and underdevelopment that lasted for generations. Women and children in forgotten wars. The participation of women and children in forgotten conflicts reveals aspects of medieval warfare that are often overlooked in accounts focusing on famous battles and famous commanders. Women played crucial roles in defending besieged cities, organizing community resistance, and maintaining economic activity during periods of conflict, yet their contributions remain largely unrecognized. The Siege of Hennebont demonstrated the military capabilities of medieval women when Jeanne de Montfort successfully commanded the city's defense against superior forces. Her tactical innovations and strategic leadership proved crucial to the outcome of the War of the Breton Succession. Yet her role receives little attention in general accounts of medieval warfare. Children were often direct participants in forgotten conflicts, serving as messengers, scouts, and even combatants in desperate situations. The participation of young people in urban revolts and peasant rebellions reveals the extent to which entire communities were mobilized for warfare, and the ways in which conflict shaped the experiences of medieval youth. The long-term consequences. The forgotten battles of medieval warfare had long-term consequences that influenced the development of European civilization in ways that are often overlooked by historians focusing on major conflicts and political developments. The cumulative impact of countless small-scale conflicts shaped regional cultures, influenced the development of military technology, and determined the fate of countless communities. The military innovations developed in forgotten conflicts often proved more influential than those associated with famous battles because they were tested and refined through repeated use in similar circumstances. The tactical developments that emerged from border warfare, urban conflicts, and peasant rebellions influenced military practice throughout Europe and beyond. The social and political changes that resulted from forgotten conflicts often had more lasting impact than those associated with famous wars because they affected larger populations and became embedded in local customs and institutions. The development of urban militias, the transformation of feudal relationships, and the emergence of new forms of popular political participation all owed much to the accumulated experience of forgotten conflicts. The forgotten battles and conflicts of medieval warfare remind us that history is not just the story of kings, heroes, and famous victories. It is also the story of ordinary people caught up in violence beyond their control, of communities that struggled to survive in a world where conflict was constant, and of the countless small decisions and local struggles that ultimately determined the shape of medieval civilization. These forgotten conflicts reveal the true scope and impact of medieval violence, showing us that warfare was not an occasional interruption of normal life, but a constant feature of medieval existence that shaped every aspect of society. From the border raids that terrorized frontier communities to the urban revolts that challenged established authority, from the peasant rebellions that sought to overturn social hierarchies to the religious wars that sought to impose spiritual conformity. These conflicts touched the lives of millions of people whose experiences remain largely unknown to us today. The military innovations, tactical developments, and strategic insights that emerged from forgotten conflicts often proved more influential than those associated with famous battles because they were tested and refined through repeated use in similar circumstances. The development of guerrilla tactics, urban warfare, and popular resistance movements all owed much to the experience gained in these smaller, less glamorous conflicts. Perhaps most importantly, the forgotten battles of medieval warfare remind us that historical significance cannot be measured solely by immediate political outcomes or contemporary fame. The cumulative impact of countless small-scale conflicts often exceeded that of single great battles in shaping the long-term development of medieval society and the emergence of the modern world. By remembering these forgotten battles and the forgotten warriors who fought them, we gain a more complete understanding of medieval warfare and its impact on human civilization. We are reminded that history belongs not just to the famous and powerful, but to all those who lived through the challenges of their time and whose experiences, however humble or forgotten, contributed to the world we inhabit today. The men and women who fought in these forgotten battles, who defended their communities against raiders, who challenged unjust authority, and who struggled to survive in a violent world, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics or footnotes, but as individuals whose choices and sacrifices shaped the course of human history. Their stories remind us that courage, determination, and the will to resist injustice are not the monopoly of famous heroes, but the common heritage of humanity itself. In studying these forgotten conflicts, we discover that medieval warfare was far more complex, varied, and consequential than accounts focusing on famous battles would suggest. We learn that the true impact of medieval violence must be measured not just in terms of political outcomes, but in terms of human experience, social transformation, and cultural development. Most importantly, we are reminded that every generation faces the challenge of preserving peace and justice in a world where conflict is always possible. and that the lessons learned from medieval warfare, both famous and forgotten, remain relevant to our own struggles today. How medieval war shaped the modern world. The impact of medieval warfare extended far beyond the Middle Ages, creating ripple effects that continue to influence our world today. The political boundaries established by medieval conflicts, the military innovations developed during medieval campaigns, and the social changes driven by medieval warfare all contributed to shaping the modern world in profound and lasting ways. This chapter examines the long-term consequences of medieval warfare, how it influenced the development of nation-states, how it drove technological innovation, and how it shaped modern military thinking. We'll explore how lessons learned on medieval battlefields continue to influence military strategy well into the modern era, and how the institutional, technological, and social transformations of the medieval period laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit today. The legacy of medieval warfare can be seen in everything from modern military organization to contemporary political boundaries, reminding us that the Middle Ages weren't a distant, irrelevant period, but a crucial chapter in human development, whose effects continue to resonate through the centuries. The foundation of modern nation-state territorial boundaries and political geography. Perhaps nowhere is the legacy of medieval warfare more visible than in the political map of modern Europe. The boundaries established through centuries of medieval conflict continue to define national identities and international relations today. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, 1337 to 1453, not only solidified the separation between these two kingdoms, but also established the principle of distinct national territories that would become fundamental to the modern state system. The process of territorial consolidation through warfare created the foundation for what political scientists call the Westphalian system of sovereign nation-states. Medieval rulers learned that effective control required not just military victory but also the ability to maintain borders, collect taxes, and administer justice across defined territories. This lesson, learned through countless battles and sieges, became the cornerstone of modern statecraft. France's emergence as a unified kingdom provides an excellent example of this process. The medieval wars against English invaders, Viking raiders, and internal rebellions forced French kings to develop centralized administrative systems that could mobilize resources across vast territories. The royal domain expanded through conquest, but more importantly, through the development of legal and administrative mechanisms that could integrate diverse regions under a single crown. This model of centralized monarchy would later influence the development of nation-states across Europe and beyond. Similarly, the Holy Roman Empire's long struggle to maintain control over its diverse territories demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of medieval political organization. The empire's eventual fragmentation into hundreds of smaller states revealed the importance of cultural and linguistic unity in creating stable political entities. This lesson would prove crucial in the later development of nationalism and the modern concept of self-determination. The evolution of royal authority. Medieval warfare fundamentally transformed the nature of royal authority and government power. The constant need to finance armies, equip knights, and maintain fortifications forced medieval rulers to develop new mechanisms of taxation and administration. These innovations in governance, born from military necessity, became the foundation of modern state power. The English development of parliamentary institutions illustrates this transformation perfectly. The need to secure funding for the Hundred Years' War forced English kings to regularly consult with their nobles and, eventually, with representatives of towns and counties. What began as a military expedient evolved into a fundamental principle of constitutional government. The famous declaration that there should be no taxation without representation emerged directly from medieval conflicts over war financing. French kings took a different approach, using the military crisis to justify the expansion of royal prerogatives and the development of a more centralized administrative system. The taille, originally an emergency war tax, became a permanent feature of royal finance. The development of royal bureaucracy, professional armies, and centralized justice systems all emerged from the medieval need to wage war more effectively. These competing models of governance, parliamentary consultation versus royal centralization, would shape political development for centuries to come. The English model influenced the development of constitutional monarchies and democratic institutions, while the French model contributed to the rise of absolute monarchy and, eventually, to revolutionary movements seeking to overthrow such concentrated power. Military service and social contract. The feudal system of military service created new concepts of political obligation that continue to influence modern ideas about citizenship and the social contract. The medieval principle that military service was tied to land tenure established the idea that political rights and obligations were interconnected. This concept would later evolve into modern notions of civic duty and the responsibilities of citizenship. The transformation of feudal military service into professional armies also marked a crucial shift in the relationship between rulers and subjects. As kings began to rely on paid soldiers rather than feudal levies, they needed to develop new sources of revenue and new justifications for their authority. This transition contributed to the development of the modern tax state and the principle that government authority derives from the governed. The medieval emphasis on military virtue and honor also contributed to developing codes of conduct that would influence later ideas about public service and civic responsibility. The chivalric ideal, despite its limitations and contradictions, established important precedents for the idea that those who hold power have special obligations to protect and serve others. Technological innovation and military revolution. Gunpowder revolution, the introduction of gunpowder weapons in medieval warfare, represents one of history's most significant technological revolutions. While gunpowder was invented in China, its military application in medieval Europe transformed not only warfare but also the entire structure of society and politics. The development of cannon technology fundamentally altered the nature of siege warfare and fortress design. Medieval castles, which had been virtually impregnable for centuries, suddenly became vulnerable to bombardment. This technological shift forced a complete reconceptualization of defensive architecture, leading to the development of trace Italian fortifications with their characteristic angular bastions and complex defensive systems. The impact extended far beyond military applications. The metallurgical advances required to produce effective cannon contributed to developments in mining, manufacturing, and engineering that would prove crucial to the later Industrial Revolution. The mathematical knowledge required for ballistics calculations advanced the study of physics and engineering. The logistical challenges of transporting and maintaining artillery trains drove innovations in transportation and supply chain management. Perhaps most importantly, gunpowder weapons democratized warfare by reducing the military advantage of heavily armored knights. A peasant with a firearm could potentially defeat a knight who had trained for years in combat. This technological shift contributed to the decline of feudalism and the rise of professional armies drawn from all social classes. Metallurgy and manufacturing, the constant demand for better weapons and armor, drove significant advances in metallurgy and manufacturing techniques. Medieval armorers and weaponsmiths developed increasingly sophisticated methods for working steel, creating alloys, and producing standardized equipment in large quantities. These developments laid the groundwork for later industrial advances. The water-powered trip hammers used in medieval weapon production were among the first applications of mechanical power to manufacturing. The blast furnaces developed to produce steel for weapons and armor represented crucial advances in industrial technology. The guild system that organized medieval weapon production also contributed to the development of quality control standards and training programs that would influence later industrial organization. The emphasis on standardization, particularly in the production of crossbow bolts and later firearms ammunition, established important precedents for mass production techniques. Naval technology and exploration. Medieval naval warfare drove innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and maritime technology that would prove crucial to the age of exploration and the development of global trade networks. The need to transport troops, supplies, and siege equipment across bodies of water led to the development of larger, more seaworthy vessels. The cog, developed in Northern Europe for both military and commercial purposes, represented a significant advance in ship design. Its large cargo capacity and improved sailing characteristics made possible both military expeditions and long-distance trade. The galley warfare of the Mediterranean drove innovations in vessel design and naval tactics that would influence maritime warfare for centuries. Navigation techniques developed for military purposes, including the use of magnetic compasses and improved charts, became essential tools for exploration and trade. The mathematical knowledge required for naval navigation contributed to advances in astronomy, geography, and cartography that would prove crucial to later scientific developments. Military organization and professional armies. The rise of professional military forces. The transition from feudal levies to professional armies represents one of the most significant legacies of medieval warfare. This transformation, driven by the need for more reliable and effective military forces, fundamentally changed the relationship between military service and political power. The development of professional armies required new systems of recruitment, training, and command that would influence military organization for centuries to come. The creation of military hierarchies, standardized equipment, and systematic training programs established precedents that continued to shape modern military institutions. The Swiss pike formations and the English longbow companies of the late medieval period demonstrated the effectiveness of well-trained, disciplined troops over traditional feudal cavalry. These innovations showed that military success depended more on organization, training, and tactics than on individual heroism or social status. This lesson would prove crucial to the development of modern military doctrine. The financial requirements of maintaining professional armies also drove innovations in military administration and logistics. The need to pay, feed, clothe, and equip large numbers of soldiers on a permanent basis required the development of sophisticated administrative systems. These military bureaucracies became models for other forms of government administration, command structure, and military hierarchy. Medieval warfare established many of the command structures and military hierarchies that continue to characterize modern armies. The development of clear chains of command, standardized ranks, and systematic promotion procedures emerged from the practical need to coordinate large military forces effectively. The medieval emphasis on military engineering and siege warfare contributed to the development of specialized military professions. The master engineers who designed siege engines and directed siege operations were among the first military specialists, establishing precedents for the technical expertise that would become increasingly important in modern warfare. The integration of different types of military units, cavalry, infantry, archers, artillery, and engineers, required the development of combined arms tactics and coordinated command systems. These innovations in military organization would prove crucial to later developments in military strategy and doctrine. Military education and training. The medieval period saw the emergence of systematic military education and training programs that would influence military development for centuries. The apprenticeship system that trained knights in combat skills established important precedents for military education, while the development of military manuals and treatises created a body of military knowledge that could be transmitted across generations. The rise of military academies and formal training institutions in the later medieval period provided models for the military education systems that would become standard in modern armies. The emphasis on both practical skills and theoretical knowledge established the principle that effective military leadership required both experience and education. The medieval development of military law and codes of conduct also contributed to modern military justice systems and rules of war. The chivalric code, despite its limitations, established important precedents for the humane treatment of prisoners and non-combatants that would later influence international humanitarian law, economic and social transformation. The military-industrial complex medieval warfare created the first version of what we now call the military-industrial complex. The constant need for weapons, armor, and military supplies drove the development of specialized industries and manufacturing centers that became crucial to economic development. The Italian city-states provide an excellent example of this phenomenon. Cities like Milan and Florence became centers of armor production, developing sophisticated manufacturing techniques and trade networks that extended across Europe. The wealth generated by military production helped finance the Renaissance and contributed to the development of banking and financial institutions. The Flemish cloth industry similarly benefited from military demand, producing textiles for military use while developing the manufacturing and commercial techniques that would make Flanders one of medieval Europe's wealthiest regions. The connection between military production and economic development established patterns that would continue to influence industrial development for centuries. Social mobility and class structure. Medieval warfare created new opportunities for social mobility that challenged traditional class structures and contributed to the development of more fluid social systems. Military service provided a path for advancement that was not dependent on birth or inherited status, establishing important precedents for meritocratic ideals. The rise of professional soldiers, military engineers, and other military specialists created new social groups that did not fit traditional feudal categories. These military professionals often achieved significant wealth and status through their service, contributing to the development of a more diverse and complex social structure. The economic disruption caused by medieval warfare also broke down traditional social arrangements and created opportunities for new forms of social organization. The depopulation caused by warfare and plague created labor shortages that strengthened the bargaining position of surviving workers and contributed to the decline of SCR-FDOM. Urban development and fortification. Medieval warfare fundamentally shaped urban development patterns that continue to influence city planning today. The need for defense drove the development of fortified cities with walls, gates, and defensive structures that determined the layout of urban spaces for centuries. The economic activity generated by military garrisons and the craftsmen who supplied them contributed to urban growth and the development of market towns. Many modern European cities trace their origins to medieval military settlements or grew significantly due to their strategic military importance. The engineering challenges of urban fortification also drove innovations in construction techniques, hydraulic engineering, and urban planning that would prove crucial to later urban development. The integration of defensive, economic, and residential functions in medieval cities established patterns of urban organization that continue to influence city planning today. Intellectual and cultural legacy. Military thought and strategic theory. Medieval warfare produced a substantial body of military literature and strategic thinking that would influence military thought for centuries. Treaties on warfare, siegecraft, and military organization established intellectual frameworks for understanding military problems that continue to influence strategic thinking today. The works of medieval military theorists like Vegetius, whose De Re Militari remained influential well into the modern period, established many of the fundamental principles of military strategy and tactics. The emphasis on logistics, training, discipline, and combined arms operations that characterized medieval military thought provided the foundation for later developments in military doctrine. The medieval development of just war theory also made crucial contributions to international law and ethics. The attempts by medieval thinkers to establish moral and legal constraints on warfare laid the groundwork for modern international humanitarian law and the laws of war. Technological innovation and scientific method. The practical problems of medieval warfare drove innovations in engineering, mathematics, and what we would now call applied science. The need to calculate trajectories for siege engines, design effective fortifications, and coordinate complex military operations required the development of mathematical and engineering techniques that contributed to the later scientific revolution. The medieval emphasis on practical experimentation and empirical observation in military contexts helped establish methodological approaches that would prove crucial to later scientific development. Military engineers who tested different siege techniques, weapon designs, and fortification systems were among the first to apply systematic experimental methods to technical problems. Legal and constitutional development. Medieval warfare contributed significantly to the development of legal institutions and constitutional principles that continue to influence modern government. The need to regulate military service, manage the relationship between military and civilian authority, and establish rules for warfare drove innovations in law and governance that would prove lasting. The development of military law and courts. Marshall established important precedents for specialized legal systems and due process rights. The medieval emphasis on the legal regulation of warfare contributed to the development of international law and the principle that even warfare should be conducted according to legal and moral constraints. Medieval warfare significantly influenced population distribution and settlement patterns across Europe and beyond. Military conquests, the establishment of military colonies, and the movement of armies and their supporters created new population centers and altered existing demographic patterns. The Crusades, for example, not only resulted in military conflicts but also led to significant population movements, the establishment of new settlements and cultural exchanges that would have lasting effects on both European and Middle Eastern societies. Similarly, the Viking raids and settlements fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of much of Northern and Western Europe. The depopulation caused by medieval warfare, particularly during periods of intensive conflict like the 100 Years' War, created opportunities for agricultural innovation and changes in land use patterns. The abandonment of marginal agricultural land and the consolidation of population in more defensible locations contributed to changes in rural organization that would influence agricultural development for centuries. Environmental and agricultural impact. Medieval warfare had significant environmental consequences that influenced later agricultural and environmental development. The destruction of crops, forests, and agricultural infrastructure during military campaigns altered local ecosystems and forced adaptations in farming practices. The need to supply large armies also drove changes in agricultural production and food preservation techniques. The development of more efficient methods for producing, storing, and transporting food supplies contributed to agricultural innovations that would prove crucial to later population growth and economic development. The environmental impact of medieval metallurgy and weapon production, including deforestation for fuel and the pollution associated with mining and smelting operations, established patterns of environmental exploitation that would continue to influence industrial development. International relations and diplomacy. Treaties and international law. Medieval warfare necessitated the development of diplomatic institutions and international legal frameworks that would provide the foundation for modern international relations. The need to negotiate truces, arrange prisoner exchanges, and establish rules for warfare drove innovations in diplomacy and international law. The medieval development of treaty-making procedures, diplomatic immunity, and international arbitration mechanisms established precedents that continue to influence international relations today. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War and established many of the principles of modern international relations, built directly on medieval precedents in treaty-making and diplomatic practice. The medieval emphasis on the legal regulation of warfare also contributed to the development of international humanitarian law. The attempts to establish rules for the conduct of warfare, the treatment of prisoners, and the protection of non-combatants laid the groundwork for modern conventions governing warfare, alliances, and balance of power. Medieval warfare established many of the principles of alliance formation and balance of power politics that continue to characterize international relations. The need to coordinate military efforts against common enemies drove the development of complex alliance systems and diplomatic networks. The medieval understanding of the importance of preventing any single power from achieving hegemony contributed to the development of balance of power theories that would influence international relations for centuries. The constant shifting of alliances and the emphasis on maintaining equilibrium among competing powers established patterns of international behavior that continue today. Conclusion: the enduring legacy, the legacy of medieval warfare, extends far beyond military history, touching virtually every aspect of modern civilization. The political institutions, technological innovations, social structures, and intellectual frameworks developed during the medieval period in response to military challenges continue to shape our world today. The nation-state system that dominates modern international relations emerged directly from the territorial consolidation and political centralization driven by medieval warfare. The professional military institutions that characterize modern armies trace their origins to the military innovations of the medieval period. The technological advances driven by military necessity laid the groundwork for later industrial and scientific developments. Perhaps most importantly, medieval warfare contributed to the development of institutional frameworks for managing violence and conflict that remain crucial to modern civilization. The legal and diplomatic mechanisms developed to regulate warfare, the constitutional principles established to control military power, and the ethical frameworks created to constrain the conduct of warfare all emerged from medieval responses to the challenges of organized violence. The social and economic transformations driven by medieval warfare also created many of the foundations of modern society. The breakdown of rigid social hierarchies, the development of market economies, and the growth of urban centers all owed much to the disruptions and opportunities created by medieval military conflicts. Understanding this legacy is crucial for appreciating not only the historical development of modern institutions, but also the contemporary challenges facing our globalized world. Many of the problems we face today, from international conflict to technological disruption to social inequality, have roots in the transformations initiated during the medieval period. The medieval period was not a dark age of ignorance and barbarism, but a crucial period of innovation and development that laid the groundwork for the modern world. The men and women who lived through the challenges of medieval warfare developed solutions to fundamental problems of human organization that continue to influence our lives today. Their legacy reminds us that periods of crisis and conflict, while often destructive, can also drive innovation and positive change. The institutional, technological, and intellectual developments that emerge from medieval warfare demonstrate humanity's capacity to adapt, innovate, and create lasting solutions to the challenges of organized violence and social organization. As we face our own challenges in the 21st century, we can learn from the medieval experience that effective responses to crisis require not just military or technological solutions, but comprehensive changes in political, social, and economic institutions. The legacy of medieval warfare shows us that lasting security and prosperity depend on developing institutions capable of managing conflict, promoting cooperation, and adapting to changing circumstances. The battles fought on medieval fields may be long over, but their consequences continue to shape our world. Understanding this legacy helps us appreciate both the achievements and the ongoing challenges of human civilization, reminding us that we are all inheritors of the struggles and innovations of those who came before us. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval warfare, it's important to reflect on what we've learned and why it matters today. The 28,000 soldiers who died in medieval conflicts weren't just statistics. They were individuals with hopes, fears, families, and dreams cut short by the brutal realities of their time. Medieval warfare teaches you several crucial lessons that remain relevant today. First, it reminds us that war is never glorious, regardless of how it's portrayed in popular culture. The reality of medieval battle was mud, blood, terror, and death, not the romantic ideal of chivalrous combat. Second, it shows us how warfare shapes not just political boundaries but entire societies. The constant threat of violence in medieval Europe influenced everything from architectural styles to social organization, from economic systems to cultural values. War wasn't something that happened to medieval society. It was something that define medieval society. Third, it demonstrates the importance of technological innovation in warfare. From the stirrup to the crossbow, from Greek fire to gunpowder, technological advances repeatedly revolutionized military tactics and, by extension, political power. The nations and leaders who adapted to new military technologies thrived, while those who clung to outdated methods were swept aside. Fourth, it reveals the human cost of political ambition. The 100 Years' War, the Crusades, the Mongol conquests, these conflicts were often driven by the ambitions of leaders who never faced the consequences of their decisions. The soldiers who died, the civilians who suffered, and the communities that were destroyed paid the price for political decisions made by people who remained safely distant from the battlefield. Finally, medieval warfare reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, people found ways to maintain dignity, honor, and hope. The development of chivalric codes, the efforts to protect non-combatants, and the attempts to limit warfare's brutality all represent humanity's ongoing struggle to find meaning and morality even in the midst of violence. Today, as we face our own challenges and conflicts, the lessons of medieval warfare remain relevant. We live in a world where technology continues to revolutionize warfare, where political decisions continue to have life and death consequences for ordinary people, and where the line between civilization and barbarism remains perilously thin. The medieval period shows us that warfare is not inevitable, but when it occurs, its consequences extend far beyond the battlefield. The choices we make today about how to resolve conflicts, how to treat our enemies, and how to protect the innocent will echo through history, just as the decisions made by medieval leaders continue to influence our world today. The 28,000 soldiers who died in medieval warfare cannot be brought back, but their sacrifice was not meaningless if we learn from their experience. They remind us that behind every statistic is a human story, behind every battle is a community affected, and behind every war is a choice between violence and peace. As we close this examination of medieval warfare, let's remember that understanding. History isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about learning lessons that can help us build a better future. The medieval period was marked by remarkable human achievements in art, literature, architecture, and philosophy, but it was also scarred by devastating warfare that left lasting wounds on human civilization. The choice of how we remember medieval warfare, whether we romanticize it or face its brutal reality, says something important about how we approach conflict in our own time. If we choose to see medieval warfare as glorious adventure, we risk repeating its mistakes. If we choose to see it as a human tragedy that we must learn from, we take the first step toward building a more peaceful world. The legacy of those 28,000 soldiers and the millions more who died in medieval conflicts should not be forgotten glory, but remembered wisdom. Their sacrifice reminds us that the cost of war is always higher than its benefits, that the price of violence is always paid by the innocent, and that the goal of understanding history should always be to help us choose peace over war, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair. In the end, medieval warfare teaches us that we are all connected across time and space by our shared humanity. The soldiers who died on medieval battlefields were not so different from us. They loved their families, feared for their futures, and hoped for better days ahead. Their stories remind us that in every age, the choice between peace and war, between compassion and cruelty, between hope and despair, remains ours to make.